When you read as much as I do, you notice patterns, you notice changes. For example, about 6 or 7 years ago, I took a greater interest in nonfiction than I had up until that point, and that interest has only grown. When I look back at the lists of books that I've read over the years, I see a shift around that time to where a significant amount of what I've read has been either nonfiction or historical. But beyond that, even the fiction that I'm reading has taken a decided shift towards one thing and away from another. And I finally realized what the basis of that shift was. And that's that I have a greater interest in fiction that has a tangible connection to the world that we live in to some extent. But first, I am Graham, a trucker who reads a lot of books. My goal is to be a full-time author and illustrator. You're helping me get there by watching this video, so thanks. Now on to the video. The big realization here for me was when I was recently reading through the Silmarillion. I'm close to halfway through. And this is a book it's a challenge for a lot of fantasy readers to get through because it's not really like any other fantasy book. It's really a giant fantasy lore dump. It wasn't the kind of thing that Tolkien published himself. Like, it was a posthumous release. It was compiled and edited by his son, and it was really for his own benefit. He started writing it in the trenches in World War I. Later events of the Lord of the Rings would refer back to it, and I think it was the YouTuber The Little Platoon who said it in such a succinct way that it's kept running through my head for the last 2 weeks. And that's that The Lord of the Rings isn't a story that wraps up something that was started in The Hobbit. It wraps up something that was started all the way back at the beginning with the Silmarillion, with like literally the creation of the world. Everything that happens in Lord of the Rings makes sense if you understand what happened in the very beginning. And that's a massive, massive amount of lore to ingest. And my prior attempts to process all of that lore have not always come to completion. I've gotten through the Ainulindale and through the Valaquenta, and then when I start going through, like, this person was here, and this person did that, and this person did this in this order, like, I lost interest in it at prior times because I wasn't so entertained by it. I will juxtapose Tolkien with Brandon Sanderson here because I'm famously on the record for saying that I've lost interest in the larger Cosmere right around the time the man is hitting peak worldwide popularity. I've kind of tapped out of his oeuvre, which to a version of me 10 years ago is unimaginable. And I was trying to analyze it and realize what the shift was, and that's that what he's created is a world or a series of worlds and a continuity entirely out of whole cloth. He's even made a point of saying that Earth as we know it does not exist in the Cosmere. And so any of his stories that connect to Earth are explicitly not in the Cosmere, which is his most elaborate fictional universe. The fifth Stormlight book is coming out in December of 2024. Amazon lists it at over 1,300 pages. I think he's doing it at this point just because he can. But he is an incredibly hardworking author, but it's not a lore that I have any interest in reading, whereas now on this read-through of just the Silmarillion alone, I am loving what I'm digging through here. And I think that's because while Tolkien was not a fan of writing allegory, he was putting truth in his myths, and the Silmarillion is less of a history of the foundation of Middle-earth and more of a scripture for Middle-earth. He was putting the truths for Middle-earth in those stories as much as he was putting in truths from our own world. How the mechanics of the fall of the elves were very similar to the mechanics of the fall of man in Judeo-Christian tradition. And as I'm reading these fictional accounts of what happened in the origins of Middle-earth and the Elvish race, I'm seeing valuable truths for the traditions by which I live. And I think being able to see something recognizable and applicable and even capital T true in it, makes it more than just a leisurely thing that I'm enjoying for entertainment's sake. The entertainment factor is there, but when I can be motivated and edified by what I'm reading, when it's to some extent practical, I find greater value in that. Sure, there are epic battle scenes and moments of heroism in the Cosmere books. I'm still very well aware of different narrative elements of characters like Kaladin and others in Stormlight, for example. But it seems like there's a steep price to pay of time investment and following this, that, and the other thing for something that I could get in a much more concentrated and distilled format from other authors, especially if I were to read things like just history or nonfiction or literary classics. I think this partly comes down to just a matter of audience. I'm the anti-lit RPG guy on YouTube, and in the year and a half since I posted that rant, I've come more to grips with the fact that I'm just not in that audience, and that's fine. It's the same thing now with the gigantic, complete, whole cloth epic fantasies of authors like Sanderson and Terry Brooks and Robert Jordan and so many others that have followed in that tradition where they just make something up from complete zero. And it's entertaining and it can have valuable principles in it, but it doesn't hook me because it doesn't have that spark of what's connected to us. I've got slated for a reread the Witchy War series by Dave Butler, which he even said it was him writing a Tolkien-esque treatment of American history that was deeply steeped in biblical lore, and not just, say, the King James version of the Bible, but many different biblical traditions, because there are a lot of them out there, not just under the umbrella of worldwide Christianity, but worldwide Judaism as well. And I could use that book and that series as a vehicle towards understanding different components of worldwide Judeo-Christian traditions. Dave is a student of those things, and if the Witchy War series is a distillation of all of the things that he has read and studied over the years into a fictional narrative, it can then be my gateway into understanding that stuff, so that if and when I do sit down to study deep biblical lore, I can have some kind of anchor point, some kind of reference point to say, okay, this is what Dave was talking about here. Let me go 10 layers deeper into this thing because I'm understanding something true from my world that I was introduced to in this fictional fantasy narrative. This extends not just from epic fantasy, but into other genres as well. Urban fantasy, I'm much more keen on enjoying a fantasy that is set in a fictional version of a real world city, say Chicago, like the Dresden Files, or there are others. I haven't read as much urban fantasy lately, just because it seems like the bulk of the genre is about who is it that said like urban fantasy is really about relationships, and especially the bestseller stuff tends to be more about like vampires and sex and erotica and stuff. And it's like I'd like to read something that was more like the first, say, dozen Dresden Files books, where it's a guy solving problems in the hidden underworld of a real city. I've long wanted to write an urban fantasy set in my hometown of Henderson, Nevada, or Las Vegas, something that could explore in that same tradition the magical underside of that city. But I wouldn't want to do it in the same way that others have, where there's, okay, we got to have humans, vampires, and werewolves, and occasionally a wizard will pop up. Like, I don't want to do those particular staples, so I'm still chewing on what I want the setting to be. But I want it to have some kind of connection to the world that I live in, just to be more of an escapist element from it. I think it makes it easier to grasp a lot of fundamental things and then just focus instead on what are the few things that are different and what are the ramifications of that change. I think this is all a consequence of the variety and the breadth of things that I read. nonfiction, history, biography, classics, and then fiction in the genres and stuff. I've shifted heavily from constructed worlds to our world in just about everything else that I read. And so I think it would make sense then that when I do sit down to consume a long and detailed fantasy, it would have to have that same connection to the world that we live in. And I might be less interested then in something as complex and layered and detailed and wholly fictional, such as the Stormlight Archive or the Wheel of Time or the Sword of Shannara. I haven't read a single one of those books. I read 4 or 5 of the Sword of Truth books by Terry Goodkind back in high school. I think I think my mom bought me those because she thought that they were basically like Tolkien. She hadn't read Tolkien so far as I know, but she was just familiar with those by reputation, and she saw one on the shelf one day. She's like, oh, here's a book with a guy with a sword and a dragon on it. And it's like, it's got some similarities to the worlds that Tolkien wrote, except there's a lot of BDSM type stuff in those Terry Goodkind books. If she had known that, she would have not have bought those for a 13-year-old son back in the day. But that's not the reason why I gave up on those a while back. But the point stands. It's just when you know what you like and you know what your tastes are, you drift towards that. But every once in a while, there's merit towards examining why. Like, why do I prefer this, especially in contrast with something else? Why did I tap out of Oathbringer 7 years ago? Why did I never even bother with, I couldn't even tell you what the 4th book is. And Oathbreaker, Stormbringer? I can't remember. My wife has read all of those, and she loves those big, detailed fantasy worlds. It's a difference in taste in ours. I've read the 7 or 8 Mistborn books that are out now, 8 if you include Secret History. And I still love that series, but now that it's connecting more and more to the Cosmere, like what was that? The Lost Metal was the most recent book, and I felt like there was a good chunk of what was going on that I was not aware of simply because I hadn't read 7 or 8 other books or series that Sanderson has written, and now he's starting to do crossovers, and I wonder what that's going to mean for future Mistborn series. He pitched that to readers back in the day as a trilogy of trilogies, and the heck of it is, I don't even think the Wax and Wayne books are supposed to be one of the trilogies. He wrote the Alloy of Law, and then in true Sanderson fashion, he's like, hang on, let me do a ton more with this before I even move on to the larger arc that I want to write later. The man just operates on a different level, and there are obviously enough worldwide fantasy readers, to enjoy reading on that level. And that's where his bread and butter is, and that's made him the absolute leading powerhouse name in epic fantasy. I'm just not in that readership. And that's all, and that's fine. Obviously, his inclination towards massive lore and stuff is spread into other series that he writes, and that's why I wasn't really all that keen on finishing the Cytonic stuff. But it is what it is. I do want to keep reading Tolkien because Lord of the Rings has a different kind of merit. It's written in a different way. It's written for a different purpose, and it resonates with me on a different level. And I'm just absolutely loving this read-through of the Silmarillion, and I'm finally at that point where I can see myself buying multiple editions of other books in his legendarium to study him to this same extent, because I think I'm finally at a level, like intellectually, where I can grasp what he was doing and why. There was a long stretch of time there where I would hold vehemently to the belief that Tom Bombadil was Tolkien's way of expressing writer's block. And the last time I read The Fellowship of the Ring and I got to the scenes with Tom Bombadil, I stopped and I thought, I think I get it now. And that's a cool thing to realize. Anyway, those are just what I'm musing on today. Seeing the way that my tastes change and knowing why. There's value in that. Thank you for watching that. To help the channel, check out my books on Amazon. Buy one, read it, tell me what you think. For October, I recommend Sleepless Hollow, a fantastic sci-fi romp with guns, ghosts, and gonzo action sequences. You can also subscribe to my Substack, where I do more detailed book reviews and longer-running projects. some of which is paywalled. Drive safe. See you out there.